Welcome once again to the Sutherland Report. It's a delight that you are joining me, a delight that I can invade your front room, your computer, wherever you are. And what is even more of a delight for me is being able to bring on some amazing people that you are connected with and to talk about their work, their creativity. And that is something that I thoroughly enjoy doing. And I am going to bring an author of a book. You saw the graphic at the beginning, and I'm now going to bring on Jonathan Swift, and we're going to talk about the book that he has just written and find out about him and the motivation for writing it. Jonathan Swift, sir, an utter delight to meet you via the digital medium. And thank you so much for joining me today and for joining my audience.
Good evening.
Jonathan, my first question, could you, because you are from a further education background, you have lived in a few places around the world, and could you just explain to my audience what you used to do for a living, where you used to teach, and what you used to teach?
Yes, I started my career as a teacher of modern languages, Spanish and French. And then I moved into, via an ESRC grant, into the higher education sector at to begin with, at Staffordshire, as then Polytechnic. And then I was awarded a senior lectureship at Salford University. I ran the MSc in international business for about 10, 12 years there, and instituted overseas residentials in Almeria in Spain, Prague and Germany. And my general duties were one of teaching and everything else associated, marking, etc., research, publications, program management, and so on. And about just under 3 years ago, I managed to escape and retire. And I can now write what I want to write.
Jonathan, in that vein, could you, before we come on to your new amazing book, which I will tell my audience that I have actually read, this will be an interview where I have actually read the person's work. Jonathan, could you explain the previous books that you have written, because it gives a bit more of an overview of where you're coming from?
Yes, certainly. The last one before this was called Brexit KBO, published by Cambridge Academic, which was a defense of Brexit, the KBO standing for the famous Churchill acronym, Keep Buggering On. And before that, there was a book on international business published by Palgrave Macmillan. I've done lots and lots. I mean, in an academic, they're not so much interested in books. They want you to write articles, as I always say, to be published in magazines, in journals that nobody ever bother reading. But the other books included one on international tourism, Latin American tourism, sorry, and then another one on a more international focus. It's all been, the books and the journals have been in the area of international business. And latterly, before my retirement, I managed to start writing about things that really interested me. Military history, for example. I've just finished a book on the War of the Pacific between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia in 1879. And the Bruges Group has also said they would like to publish that. So it's why, but now, as I say, now I have the choice of doing what I want to. It's moving more towards military history than anything else, and politics.
No, Jonathan, thank you, because one of the delights of meeting you and having a conversation is that I have really come to the conclusion that there is an extremely interesting person to talk to and very, very rounded. And it is reflected in the book, your latest book that's about to be physically published under the Bruges Group banner. And that is really, it's very, very important because it really comes out. So, Jonathan, what is the book that we are about to discuss, sir? What's your latest that is coming out very shortly?
It's firstly, I must point out, it's unlike any of the other stuff I've written. It is fiction, or more precisely, I think the term is faction,
Hmm.
because it's a mixture of a lot of facts with fiction. It's designed as my take on how the coronavirus epidemic began, and I point the finger firmly at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and what happened subsequently. There's been a lot of work on written by people on the effects of lockdown and things. To be honest, that's not what interests me. I'm more interested in why did this happen? How did it happen? Who made it happen? And everything I've read prior to writing this novel suggests that it was the Chinese authorities. I mean, they've denied it, obviously, they would do. And the WHO is so weak and weak-willed that any investigations were done on Chinese terms, which, as everybody knows, is very easy to cover things up if you don't want them to be found out. But generally, there have been a lot of reports published, a lot of them from the States, in which they suggest it really was the Chinese that did it. And I'm afraid that no amount of contradiction from Beijing will convince me otherwise.
Jonathan, thank you. But having read your book, and I loved it. And as a filmmaker, I loved it because I immediately
Thank you.
see it in cinematic forms. And I'm not just saying that because you're here, because I think it's extremely clever. Why? In a way, I already know the answer, but I think it's really, really important to take this. You've alluded to reading all the reports where people have made comments on lockdown, etc., with various things that have come out of America. And we go back to 2020, we go back to March 2020. And I remember being told, and I looked it up, that on the government website, coronavirus had been downgraded from a highly infectious disease to a not so highly infectious disease. And you have referred to the WHO, run by Tetros, I'm a communist, etc., who are in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. What was your motivation to writing it from a fictional angle, Jonathan? What was your motivation from doing that?
Two things, really. I think if I'd written it as an academic investigative text, one, I would have not been able to include so much detail. And two, I would have probably been sued because I couldn't actually back up everything that I've said. But as it's fiction, and as it's obviously sold as a fictional book, then a lot of this is my interpretation. And even in today's woke-ridden world, we still are allowed to put our own interpretation on things. Well, as far as I'm aware, we are. So basically, yes, it's because I can actually start to say what I really believe, and because I'm not identifying given figures or organizations as such and pointing the finger of guilt at them, then it's perfectly legitimate.
Jonathan, I mean, through the book and having got to know you through conversation, and it's really, I would really love you to describe it. What I love about the book is the details, is the fact that you are then saying, right, we're now at this lab, we're now in this street, we're now walking through here, and it's as though you actually know the places that you are describing. So could you tell me how you created that? Where would you go in regard to your research to find all that out? Because you painted, as we say in filmmaking or script writing, you painted a world. So how did you go about doing that?
Well, in that one, it was slightly different. But generally, when I'm writing, I'm in the process of another book at the moment, set in Almeria in southern Spain, and I know that city like the back of my hand, so I can do that very easily. With regard to the Chinese book, the COVID book, there are two main centres. One is Beijing, and the other one is Wuhan. And basically, I got onto Google Maps and looked it up, and looked at the names of the streets and worked out where people would have to go. And having visited China on a number of occasions, I can honestly say that I've used description. It's like all fiction, isn't it? I mean, we take a bit of this and a bit of that, and we mix them up. And as a filmmaker, you must know, you must have had this. You look at a place and it says it's set in, I don't know, Manchester, and you think, hang on, they've taken them 2 minutes walk. How can they get from Wythenshawe to Bury in 2 minutes or something? This isn't right.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know the description of the girl's flat, the stone concrete steps outside that are all withered. I've seen that sort of thing in it was actually Jinan, not Wuhan, but it's the same sort of idea.
But so, in other words, it's brilliant. You are saying you understand the culture, you understand the street, you've got the mood from that, from your experience. I'm slightly tickled in the fact that you went on Google Maps and looked it all up, considering the amount of data that
Can I
particular
just
country.
add though? Can I just add that the first time I went on Google Maps to check that, the distance between the Wuhan Institute and the wet fish market was not as much as it was later on, because somebody, I am convinced, has actually manipulated Google Maps to make that a lot further away.
Wow. So what was it originally
I'll
when
be
you
honest, I can't remember the exact distance, but it was no more than about 4 miles or so.
Hmm.
Now, the latest time I've looked, one, it was very difficult to get hold of. And secondly, it was something like 25 miles, if I remember correctly. But I know we're being recorded, but please don't quote me on that because I can't remember the exact distances.
No,
But all I
not
can
at all.
remember is between first and second analyses of that map, there was a big difference. It was almost as if somebody had moved the Wuhan Institute to the other side of Wuhan. I'm
And
saying
what would
nothing.
the excuse me, what would the reasons do you think for doing something like that?
Well, if I had a nasty little suspicious mind, which obviously I don't, I might consider that it's because a lot of people were getting onto Google Maps and looking at the Wuhan Institute, and certain people didn't really like it. I mean, I've had experience of that before. I went with a colleague from Manchester University for 2 weeks to teach at a university in China. And I think it was the second day he came and knocked on my door in the hotel and said, I can't get onto the internet. There's something wrong. I said, there's nothing wrong. They just block it in China. So he said, oh, can't we get it at all? What about email? I said, there might be a way of doing it, but you've got to remember, you're not in a free, open society. And therefore you will have to put up with these things. Be quiet and eat your noodles.
Jonathan, I can really imagine you saying that. Absolutely brilliant. But it is rather ironic, isn't it, where we're discussing data collection of a particular country in a way, or I'm alluding to that, and then look at the manipulation they do. But let's get into the book. Where would you start So you've got, your mind was going, you were questioning. How do you marry up the questioning and then thinking, right, I want to write it in this particular way because I want to get my viewpoint out. What was the initial spark of this? Because you were questioning everything that was going on. But what was the initial spark and then thinking, I need to write this?
I suppose the initial spark was when I can't remember the exact date, but it was after the WHO had been invited to renew the Wuhan Institute. And there was somebody who said, as far as we're concerned, they have done absolutely nothing wrong. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, come on, this is absolute nonsense. This is a cover up. And then somebody, it might have been President Trump, but I don't know, said something like, well, they would say that because the WHO is owned mostly by China and is therefore told what to do because they're a big paymaster. And something just enraged me. I thought, no, this can't be right. I'll never find enough evidence to write a proper investigative journalistic piece about it. But I can do a lot by my knowledge of the culture and what's going on to start people thinking. The old adage about no smoke without fire, as it were, it's true under these circumstances. It was basically, I don't know, I just got rather cross by the fact that there was economies throughout the world were destroyed because of lockdown. Whether you would think it should have been done or not is another issue. But there was so much misery caused by this. And yet the Chinese leadership, the Communist Party, just seemed to sail through it all as if nothing had happened. It annoyed me.
And of course, it annoyed you, your life experience, your teaching experience, everything. It also, and also with your travel experience, and with with being out in South America at one point in your life as well. That all came into it. So, how long did it take you to map the book out? Because like anything, I'm going to say the obvious. You've got a beginning, and of course, you need the end. So, how long did it take you to map this out, and then to then finish that?
Before I answer that, can I just take us back a second to your reference to Latin America?
Mm.
As you correctly pointed out, I've spent some time in Latin America, and I've got colleagues in Colombia very much. And talking to them, there is a general consensus that they tend to agree. It was the Chinese. It might not have
Mm.
been done deliberately, but it certainly emanated from the Wuhan Institute. Now, you wanted to know about the beginning and the middle and end of the book. Was that right? Sorry.
Yes, yes.
To be honest with you, I started out with the first page where it's called Disaster, where the virus leaks. Because I've had academic training, I tend to look at things in a chronological point of view. So I wrote that bit and I thought, right, that's the end chapter done. And then I wrote the rest and I thought, nah, it doesn't have a grip. It doesn't have a hook to draw you in. And I thought, what about moving this around? So the end is the start. I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
And I in some ways, it's the classic is where you're trying not to give away the plot, but the fact is that the plot is there in the fact that it's the big question of how COVID-19 came about. Now, were you influenced by, there's been some previous films like Contagion or anything like that? Did that spark off any like and things like World War Z and stuff like that, where everyone becomes a zombie after
I
catching something.
tell you the truth, I'm rather fed up of American films about zombies. It seems to be a sort of perennial theme of American films in many of them about that. So anything to do with zombies, I just ignore. The Contagion one, was that with Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks or somebody? I can't remember offhand.
Was Gwyneth Paltrow in there?
Yes, I think she was.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
interesting. One that I've always stuck in the back of my mind as being a major influence on this and a lot of other things was a book written years ago by Michael Crichton called
Yes.
The Andromeda Strain. You know it.
Mm.
About a virus that's brought down when a spacecraft bit crashes or something, if I remember rightly. It was very, very clever. And I remember thinking, if I could produce something half as good as what he did, I'd be very pleased.
Well, the thing is, I mean, Crichton also, I think it was Grey's Anatomy. He was behind that television show, but of course, it's Jurassic Park as well.
Yes,
And he is no longer with us, but he said some very, very interesting things because he did think outside the box. Would you agree or not?
yes, definitely. And his a lot of his stuff is, I think, what tends to my mind to be a theme throughout many of his novels is this idea of taking what is current and through incremental logic expanding it into something horrific. That I can't remember the title of it, but there's one he's done about, and is it nanoparticles?
Right,
Um,
right.
I honestly can't remember them all, but definitely the Andromeda Strain was the start of it for me.
Because one of the things that strikes me in your book, and especially when you are talking about your academic background, is, and I'm going to, it seems a bit of a silly thing to say in many ways, but the book has to make sense. It has to add up. It has got to be believable. And to me, it is believable, but that's partly because I'm quite biased because I completely and utterly agree with you of your fictional outcome, because I would turn around and go, yes, because if we look back at what happened, wasn't there some kind of military world games in the summer beforehand? Where do you think that played into everything that then grew out of that?
I looked at that and I made the decision not to include anything on it because the amount of information I could get was very, very scarce. As I recall, it was the summer before the outbreak, and it would have been interesting, but to be honest, space and access to information put paid to that. I one of the things that I did want to get across is that, and anybody who knows China will probably agree, that the ordinary Chinese citizen is probably as unaware of what happened as anybody else. And probably a lot of the Chinese military are as well. The real villains in this is the Chinese Communist Party. And I could go on and include Russia in that, but let's just not at the moment, because we'd be here for the now, I don't know, next 200 years or something.
And in regard to the film Contagion, of course, I think this whole thing of Ebola, and then I'm
That's right.
thinking
Yeah.
of Boris Johnson's dad Stanley writing a book in 1982 called The Virus. So
Mm.
there is definitely and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's definitely a kind of programming going on, isn't there? I mean, you make that reference to zombie films of being fed up with them, and I get that because I also see that as a programming effort. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would agree. I just there's been quite a few. I can remember years ago, my father, who has died just a year ago. He was a marine biologist working for the UN and the Whitefish Authority in the UK, and I can remember talking to him about I think it was the one before the moon landings or the one after, the one where they brought the space rock back. Now I can't remember which Apollo that was, but he was absolutely horrified. He said, "For goodness sake, do they not realize if they open that, it could let out anything, and we are not prepared?" And that's another thing that's always stuck in my mind. As a scientist, he was very worried about this sort of thing. And I said, but surely they're going to make sure that nothing can possibly get out if there is any bacteria, virus there in the first place. And he sort of looked at me and said, "You really think so?" Anyway.
Wow. I mean, it says that, I mean, it's that whole thing of, and that's why I love your book, because it's that whole thing of what do you tell people, what do you not? And you have been extremely clever in the vehicle that you have used of fiction to tell an extremely important story. In in writing this, and of course you would have been discussing this with your nearest and dearest, and maybe, certain friends might have gathered that you were writing this story. Has anyone actually challenged you and said, I don't agree with this, Jonathan, or this is a very clever way of actually saying, I'm glad that someone else is questioning this in a clever way, because it's affirmed the fact that maybe they weren't going mad. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely to the contrary. All friends and family who I've discussed it with, as we've gone along in the writing process, um, they've all said, "Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Of course the Chinese did it," or words to that effect. Nobody has actually questioned it or gainsaid it at all. They've all said, "Yes, you're right." My sister, for example, who lives near York, she said, "Yes, go ahead, write it." They're very supportive, and nobody has. And generally, you will find, I'm sure you would agree, that your biggest critics are to be found within the family, and none of them have said anything. They haven't seen the final product yet, but the idea and the premise, they've all agreed with it.
Well, that's extremely heartening, and it's not about being a bunch of sycophants going. It's
No,
because it's
no.
you, Jonathan, and your family. You're absolutely right. They are your harshest critics. But I really commend you, because what I liked is the way that you would, every chapter it's placed. This is where this is happening. This is where this is happening, and it's extremely credible because you have done the research and you back that up. And of course, you've alluded to Google Earth, and I don't. In one way, I can't give the plot away because the plot is obvious in one sense, but what, and my personal opinion, but what you have done is to draw people in. I think this is why this is important. You're to draw people in that may be questioning it, and then suddenly go, do you know what? I've read this. That's why I've talked about family. I am absolutely right. I'm not going round the bend. This is a fantastic way of explaining this to people. So I think, sir, that you are about to do people's mental health the world of good, because there is no doubt about it that people's mental health has been attacked over the last few years, because they've had to question, if they should have been questioning everything. Suddenly, all the propaganda we've seen, and I use that word non-advisory because I believe it, through the press, etc., etc. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. It's taken a big toll out of many people's lives. My wife and I were talking a while ago and saying basically it's 3 years lost to our life. We just moved into this house just at about the height of lockdown, and we virtually didn't go out of the house. So only after about 2.5, 3 years or so have we started to explore the area. The first time we drove out in the car, there were police circling around all over, and we decided that, discretion being the better part of valor, we'd go back home and sit in the back garden and have a bottle of wine instead. But it has lost a certain amount of time for many people throughout their lives. It's just gone.
And having written a book where it is about, of course, Wuhan, based in China, in many ways, with the whole lockdown thing, you've just described the CCP and the communism and how they would run China. So,
Mm.
which we then adopted throughout the world. Well, I mean,
Mm.
that is
Mm.
what absolutely happened. So, I want to
And
thank
if
you
I
for
could just add, of course,
yeah.
the lockdown in China came in great waves and was even more stringent, dare I say, barbaric than in this or any other Western country. I mean, literally, people were being prevented from leaving their buildings, as I understand it.
Well,
So,
let's remind ourselves, weren't they sealing up doors, either
yes, I think
welding
so.
doors of
Yes.
flats? Yeah.
Yes,
And then
I must say I seem to remember that, and I seem to remember thinking at the time, it's a pity they didn't seal them up before to stop the virus escaping. But never mind.
well, that was one of your motivations for then writing it, because that was a spark then to question that. We remember that. We remember all the bodies. They were being shown to fall down, fall in the street, etc., etc. I think what was even more horrifying was people over here demanding that maybe we should be doing that ourselves, which is locking people in their homes and screwing their doors up.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you say about people falling down in the street and dead and things, and at the time, because I read a lot of military history, I can remember I was in the middle of a book about the siege of Leningrad in World War II, where they described just that same thing, bodies falling down in the street, and it was quite horrific. But there were so many parallels, even though the reason was very different. It's something I think that we are gradually adjusting to, but there is still a legacy, and there is still a legacy in the workplace. Many people have not gone back into the office, so to speak. They're still trying to force them to go back in. Just before I retired, I was teaching, but COVID restrictions meant that we couldn't do face-to-face teaching. So I had to teach remotely using, I think the session they used there was called Teams, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a horrendous experience, certainly for the staff, and I'm sure for the students, because I was talking to a sort of void. I felt like asking, "Is there anybody out there?" every so often. All I can remember is sitting in front of the screen with the PowerPoint slides being shown and talking to a void. And I can always remember that film with, I think it was Clint Eastwood, Play Misty for Me, where there's a sort of late night chat show host, and there's fog coming in from the California Bay or something, and you just don't know who on earth's listening, and there's no way of telling. So yes, a horrendous experience, and one that is still with us, and I suspect has changed work patterns irrevocably.
It's interesting you raise that, because we're still trying to persuade the civil service to go back to work over here, aren't we? Aren't we? Aren't we?
Yes.
Aren't we? We're still trying to get government officials to go back into the offices. I mean, it astounds me, frankly. It utterly astounds me. That's why I'm making references to the mental health issues.
I just, almost tongue in cheek, what one might add. Interestingly, they were very willing to go when there was a party.
I can't think of what you are alluding to.
I'm
Maybe
sure not.
getting,
Neither can
getting,
I.
getting, getting rid of. Yes. Anyway, we won't go down that road.
Perhaps we
John.
better
Well,
cut that bit
I'd
out.
like to. I'd like to. I think that'd be an interview on another day. I think because we're going to do that. Jonathan, could you please give the name of your book? Could you please say where your book is going to be available? I know it's coming under the Bruges Group publishing arm, but could you go through those details?
Yes, the full title will be COVID-19: The Birth of a Killer, by myself, and where it's going to be available at the moment, we're not sure of everywhere. Certainly, it'll be on Amazon. I've discussed with the director of the Bruges Group other outlets. I haven't got anything firm from him. We'd be more interested in getting the book finished at the moment. But I would like to put some flyers around the bookshops. I think are at the airports would be a good place, because people at airports generally have time on their hands, and something to pick up at, I don't know, W.H. Smith's and read on the plane would be interesting. And then if they can leave it wherever they've gone on business or holiday and somebody else reads it, all the better. The message gets round.
As long as it
I
doesn't
don't know.
remind.
I think also we want.
Sorry.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say
I
as
was going
long
to
as it
say,
doesn't. Jonathan, I do apologise. You go. You go.
no. What were you saying? As long as it doesn't.
As long as it doesn't remind them of why we shut down the aircraft industry in the first place, because we're all
It
was a
doesn't
comment.
seem to have done a lot of them any harm in the long run.
No.
I don't want to go down too many blind alleys, but I'm a bit annoyed about many of the airlines. They managed to get rid of half their staff during COVID, and suddenly they're screaming that they can't run their aircraft because they haven't got enough staff. Well, you know, QED.
Well, it's very interesting you raised that point because when that is been a huge issue in America, for argument's sake, where they've got signs going, for hire, we need staff, but they
Mm,
can't get them.
mm,
But I think that also refers back to what you were commenting on, people being locked down in houses, working practice and all that, and the fact that they were paid to stay at home. But that is another issue. So Jonathan, thank you. So it's going to come under the Bruise Group Publishing, be available on Amazon. It'll also be available on the Bruise Group website as well. And then what will happen is that there will be a rollout, and I'm sure you and I will have a conversation again. But I'm sure that there will be then other outlets. Jonathan, we're going to end now, but I just want to thank you for writing this book, and I want to implore everyone to go and buy it, go and get it, because the other
thank
thing
you.
is, if nothing else, if you buy it, then you can buy it for someone else that maybe needs to have this information and have it fed to them in a very, very clever way. Because, as I know myself, Jonathan, having battered on and beaten over a number of subjects over the last few years, sometimes, of course, people switch off, and then we have to
Mm.
learn how to pitch things to them and the particular vehicle that we have to choose to then do that. Jonathan, I just want to thank you for joining me today. You do write, I think you do write for the Bruise Group, and I'm just wondering
Yes.
if you could tell everyone where they can find your writings and your blogging.
Well, I've written for blogs for the Bruise Group since I think it was 2016. Mostly, if you go to the Bruce Group website, and at the top right of the page, there is it says blogs. Click on that, and then you've really just got to go work your way down through them. I must have done, oh, I don't know, 15, 20 or something by now. Mostly they are aimed at Brexit. The latest one, if I recall rightly, was called What Have They Done With My Country? And that was inspired by Palestinian, I'll choose my words very carefully now, Palestinian, pro-Palestinian marches in Manchester. When I took my daughter to have a look around Manchester University, and we could hardly hear ourselves think because of the noise outside. And I was rather incensed that people should bring their own arguments into what I regard as my country and start shouting about Palestine in front of the Alan Turing building, the Holy Name Church on Oxford Road. So, anyway.
Jonathan, I hear you very, very loudly, and you and I need to. Well, we hopefully we will be doing very soon. We need to sit down and have a long discussion. But I thank you for joining me. I thank you for writing this book because it is I think it's a very, very important. It's a vital subject because we push the world off a cliff for 3 years, and as you've said, for 3.5 years, and all the ramifications of that. And your motivation was to write this out of, yeah, you got angry, but it was thinking of a vehicle that you could use to write it. So I just want to thank you for joining me today. I'm going to play us out, and just thank everyone for joining us. Just to say that please, when the book will be out very shortly, look it up, go buy it, get it out there, because this is an extremely important subject. Thank you
Thank you.
again.
Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you.